Welcome to Reporters. I'm Sue Lloyd-Roberts. The poor countries of the world will be offered one of those occasions when they can confront the rich at the forthcoming World Trade Organization meeting in Cancun in Mexico. Delegates from inside the conference hall and the usual crowd of protesters outside will argue that the current world trade arrangements only go to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. I've been to the West African country of Mali, where they say they're suffering in two ways. They claim that because of unfair American subsidies, they can't export their cotton, and because of the dumping of dairy products by Europe, they can't sell their own milk in their own country. Mali seldom grabs the world's attention, apart from the continuing claim to our sympathy as one of the poorest countries in the world. The national profile is filled with grief, a life expectancy of 48, among the lowest in Africa, one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world, and every day about a third of the people eat less than the minimum required for a healthy life. But Mali is forcing itself onto the world's conscience at the forthcoming trade meeting, where the poor will confront the rich. The president, along with other leaders of Western Africa, will be saying enough. They'll be protesting at the unfair trade practices of the developed nations, which they say keep them rich while condemning the countries of the developing world to remain poor.
Ce qui nous amène à poser un problème crucial.
We must ask a crucial question. What is the use of them shouting day after day that we need to fight poverty, while it's their subsidies that actually contribute to making us poorer? This is the fundamental problem.
C'est là le problème fondamental.
The anti-globalization lobby tell you that if you want to see a negative example of globalization, you need look no further than here in Mali, where 3 million cotton growers are struggling to survive because, they say, the American government pays huge subsidies to some 25,000 cotton growers 4,500 miles away. Mali and its neighbours depend on cotton for foreign earnings, which are vital for these least developed countries to progress. But in the last few years, American subsidies have brought cotton prices down to a level not seen since the Depression of the 1930s. The Malian government asks how can they, with arguably the world's most cost-effective producers of cotton, compete with their pampered American counterparts. American cotton farmers received nearly $4 billion in subsidies from their government last year. That's more than the annual income of the poorest West African countries. Some in the cotton trade argue that without those subsidies, cotton prices would rise by 26%, making the difference between a decent living or living in debt for millions of Africans. All this will be on the agenda at the meeting in Cancun, and the aid agencies are lobbying furiously. Oxfam has invited the British fashion designer Catherine Hamnett to Mali to support the cause. She's designed the T-shirt to match the campaign, and she wants to alert the attention of the American voter.
Ça c'est Bamba et Frères. And I hope that it's just going to start people thinking about what's actually happening, because it's taxpayers' money that's being used for this. And, you know, the whole world right now needs its taxpayers' money to be spent on things that it needs rather than wasted on useless cotton subsidies. The value of the cotton subsidy to American farmers actually exceeds the value of the crop that they produce, and causes enormous suffering across the rest of the world with people who aren't actually equipped in a situation to help themselves. A lot of countries in Africa haven't even got a representative at the World Trade Organization.
Their campaign is on behalf of men like Burema Kone. 5 years ago, his 3 hectares of cotton provided an income of $300 a year, which allowed him to feed his 8 children and send the 5 older ones to school. Now, after paying for fertilizers and insecticides, he makes a loss of $150 and relies on the charity of the village to survive. Like all cotton farmers in Mali, Mr. Kone sells his cotton through the state monopoly, CMDT, La Compagnie Malienne pour le Développement du Textile, who also control the supply of the chemicals he puts on his land. He knows nothing about the world cotton market. He only knows of one enemy.
CMDT play a cruel trick on us. They collect the cotton from the entire village together. They deduct what we owe them for the fertilizers and so on from the money due to all of us, and the problem has to be solved by the village. You know, they set one house against another. Those who have made a loss have to pay those who have made a profit. In the past, I've had to sell my bull and some maize to pay the debt. Last year, I had to sell 3 goats and some mangoes. Now I have only 3 goats left, and once we've all run out of money, I don't know what will happen.
So who do you blame?
If there is anyone to blame, it must be CMDT. They are the ones who set the high price for our supplies and who buy our cotton at a loss. Even if there is someone else to blame, the only ones we know are this company.
And in this view of the cause of his problems, Mr. Kone has an unlikely supporter. President Bush, who visited Africa earlier this year, and who also prefers to blame mismanagement within the producing country rather than American subsidies. Nonetheless, on his trip, the president said he wanted to encourage African trade. I asked the American ambassador to Mali whether cutting cotton subsidies wouldn't be a way of showing he means it.
If you reduce all those subsidies, you still are only going to get 12 cents more per kilo.
Which is 26%.
That's going to help, but is this going to go into the pocket of CNDT? Is this going to reach the producer? It won't if Mali doesn't go ahead with privatization. Mali's working with the World Bank to fix this, and they're working on privatization. This is critical because in a monopoly situation, these farmers, these producers really aren't going to benefit that much.
The Oxfam team, who firmly believe that American subsidies should be reduced, are invited to a meeting at the Ministry of Agriculture, where they ask about the American belief in privatization. The minister says that the Malian government is privatizing the cotton industry and is breaking up the monopoly once enjoyed by CMDT. The president of CMDT says he's laid off hundreds of workers in a streamlining operation which would surely please American management consultants. So I asked him why the farmers still blame his company for their problems.
The
company has been in deficit since 1999, so no one can say that we're deliberately shortchanging the farmers to benefit ourselves. The reality is that the farming products are expensive in Mali, and it costs a lot to get them to the farmer, and maybe that's what the farmers don't understand. Even those farmers who've begun to try to buy these supplies themselves are beginning to realize that it's very expensive. I tell you, all one can wish for Mali is that the price on the international cotton market recovers, so that the farmers can get more.
So who are we to believe is killing off the Malian cotton industry? The result is that the dream that Barome Kone once had of building a school and a health centre in his village has long since disappeared. He and the Americans blame the Malian government for tolerating the powerful CMDT. The government, the company, and the aid agencies blame the Americans. I asked a man in the middle, who acts as a negotiator between the farmers and CMDT, and who knows both sides, for his opinion.
You simply can't compare CMDT with the United States. I know that from now on, CMDT is not as powerful as it was before. It cannot harm the farmers. Everything they do is now investigated and watched by the producers, the government, and even aid agencies. They can't do more harm. I beg the developed countries to stop the subsidies to their farmers because they're harming us. I beg them to listen to the cries of our poor. I can't blame them for making excuses and for wanting to give subsidies to their farmers. But can't they give them in such a way that our farmers don't die as a result?
So are American complaints about mismanagement and privatization just an excuse for not doing anything?
We're not saying that, because I think President Bush was quite clear. That's part of the reason for Cancun, is so that we can discuss the reduction of subsidies and price distortions around the world. My point is, if we want to make this work, we've got to see some reforms in the developing country as well. And my other point, of course, is that the European Union is placing 90% of the agricultural subsidies. So there's a long ways also for the European Union to go.
Mindful of the words of the American ambassador, I set off on a 400-mile journey north. It's here you find the cattle farming areas of central Mali. I wanted to investigate Europe's wrongdoings in this beleaguered country. For centuries, people in this region have been cattle farmers, and the pastoral tradition is a vital part of the national identity. But the once mighty herds have diminished. The fault, people tell you, of drought and the intervention by Europe's dairy farmers. If these cows had been lucky enough to be born in Europe, each one would attract a subsidy of €2 a day. Instead, the Malian farmer, without the benefit of subsidies, is more likely to be surviving on less than €1 a day. And these days he's to be found driving his cattle to market. When we arrived here with our camera, the market boss grabbed me and insisted on introducing me to one of them.
I used to have 800 head of cattle, and now I only have 40. I had to sell them to feed my family, but even so, many of my family have had to leave the country to look for jobs abroad.
So much livestock is being sold that the price has plummeted. But still, it's the only option for many breeders who can no longer afford to feed their cows to produce milk, which the milk processing plants won't use. The dairy farmers of Mali, with their lean, undernourished stock, have lost out to the fat cows of Europe.
The dumping of European milk here in Mali is causing a lot of damage. You see, the local dairy processing factory simply no longer wants our milk. They can get other milk cheaper from Europe. You know, it's not as if we haven't tried to help ourselves. Some of us even went to France and Holland to try to improve our breeding stock. But the imports of European milk means that we'll never get a chance to compete.
A town like Mopti once flourished on the wealth of the cattle breeders. Today it's surrounded by the slum dwellings of those who've lost their herds. The country's former aristocrats are now living in squatter camps. Look, this man says, that's where we used to live, and now the entire family have to squash into this hut, which, he adds, floods regularly during the rainy season. Imagine what it's like for my mother, he says, who once presided over a grand house with servants. He told me his father had died of asthma because they couldn't afford the medicine to treat him. Another former cattle owner, Mr. Kelly, told me he once had a herd of 200 and he's now left with 20. And there are dozens of us like that, he says. We all once had large farms and hundreds of cattle. He took me to his new home. 5 rooms around a central courtyard, which he, his wife and 8 children share with 5 other families.
I have suffered so much. It all began with the big drought back in 1983. That's when I started having to sell my stock, and it became very difficult to sell the milk. Later, my eldest son died because we couldn't pay for the medicine, and then my first wife left me. Now I have to send my second wife out to work. Imagine what it's like living like this if you were used to living in a big house.
It would be wrong to blame all Mr. Kelly's woes entirely on dumping by European farmers. Mali suffers from cyclical droughts, the worst in 1983, when 5 million cattle died. The country's stock recovered, but then came political turmoil in 1991, when many breeders lost out again. During these catastrophes, Mali was grateful for dairy imports from donor countries, including the European Union. The diet is too dependent on milk products to go without it. The trouble is that during drought-free periods like today, when the breeders want to rebuild their herds and dairy production, the supplies of subsidized dairy products from Europe keep coming in ever-increasing quantities. Here, in a local milk processing plant, they reconstitute powdered milk from Europe into a liquid form to sell. It's cheaper, and it'll last longer than local fresh produce. People are getting a taste for the powdered milk from Europe, which is often flavoured and sugared. What started as aid has become the dominant and sometimes the only dairy product available. Confronted by Europe's dairy mountain, the cattle breeders are pleading for help.
Sending powdered milk here only harms us. If only we could find someone who would help us develop our own dairy industry so that we can put a stop to these imports. However, should you find someone who will help us, tell them that the money must come directly to us and not to the government.
Back in the capital, Bamako, I was told that Dr. Ba, a spokesman for the rural community, might know why the cattle farmers so distrust the government. Dr. Ba has written to the government, accusing it of using a $100 million grant from the World Bank and from the Dutch ineffectively. He says the money is being spent on farming institutions in Mali and not on the cattle breeders who need it.
There are two reasons for this mistake. First, the donors are interested in institutional support because there is a need for their expertise and they can send their own international experts here. And then the local administration is to blame. They say they want the means of transportation, vehicles and computers and so on. You yourself went up north. You've seen the cattle farmers have no help with production. That is our problem. The state and its functionaries are responsible for this, and the donors are even more to blame because they are not interested in helping our dairy production, because they sell their milk here. We are a consumer market for the European and other international surpluses.
We made repeated requests to talk to the head of the European delegation here in Mali about the impact of European dairy imports. But after 2 weeks of trying, Mr. de Sturmek came back to us saying that the issue was very complicated, he didn't have time to prepare an answer, and anyway, he couldn't see us. Later, a spokesman from Brussels informed us that although the EU exports 4,000 metric tons of powdered milk a year to Mali, the amount was unlikely to disrupt the local market. A blame culture is stalking Mali, born of despair. Everyone is agreed that the situation is desperate, but at the lowest level, where the suffering is worse, no one can tell you why. Do you know why the price of cotton fell?
From 2 years ago, when the price began to fall, to today, to be honest, I don't know why.
I've heard the talk about foreigners dumping milk on us here, which affects our sales. But generally, we don't get told anything, so I don't really know. I only know that I have nothing to spend.
Those who claim to know where the blame lies are agreed that the matter must be addressed at the World Trade Meeting in Mexico, which offers a rare opportunity for those from the developing world to challenge the wealthy nations.
They shouldn't make any compromise on that. It has to be set a specific deadline within which subsidies will be completely and entirely phased out.
What we hope is that we can convince the farmers who have a vote, who have senators, who have representatives, that, look, there is an impact abroad. We all have at heart to see these countries like Mali get on the road to sustainable development.
We don't ask for anything else, nothing else at all. We're not asking for help. We only ask that everyone plays by the rules of the game.
The people in the villages of Mali don't know about the high stakes being played out in Mexico. They only see their lives getting harder, and they can be forgiven for wanting a change. And that's all from Reporters for this week.